Cool. Okay, so hello, hi, my name is Mia. I'm the curator and program manager at A Space Arts, and we look after a number of projects in Southampton. One of them is the Arches Studios, so we run a studio space in the city. We have a graduate scheme called. We also run a building called God's Tower, which is an arts and heritage venue based in the Old Town in Southampton. And tonight we're going to be talking about our current exhibition at GHT, which is Anna Bunting-Branch's Holding Space. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Artist Voices programme before I hand over to our guest speakers. So Artist Voices is a series of panel discussions and conversations that aim to support artist development by unpacking and demystifying key topics and issues of the visual arts ecology through discussion with artists and cultural workers. Each event is developed in response to the current exhibition at our headline venue. As I mentioned, tonight we'll be talking about Anna's exhibition, Holding Space, and we'll be discussing socially engaged practice and how artists can work with communities as a form of activism. The event is being recorded, just to let you know. It will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel next week. And if you'd rather not be recorded, if you'd rather not be on the footage, then just switch off your camera. And yes, please do share it with your friends once it's up on our YouTube channel. It's quite important to us that this becomes a resource that sits with Anna's exhibition and people can kind of access it after the event. So yes, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. So first up, we have Anna Bunting-Branch. Anna is an artist who lives and works in London, moving between painting, writing, and animation. Her work explores spaces of future revision, from feminist collective action to speculative fiction and fan activity. Her work is often collaborative, seeking out opportunities to engage with communities and other disciplines. Her current show at GHT, Holding Space, explores the role of reproductive refusal in climate activism and considers how environmental factors affect decisions about bringing children into the world. During the course of the exhibition, Anna has been hosting gatherings for a small group in the gallery, which she'll be speaking more about later this evening. Anna will be guest moderating tonight, as well as contributing to the conversation. Our second guest speaker is Rosie Carr. Hi, Rosie. Rosie is an artist, composer, and gardener based in Thanet, working on researching collaborative projects in community gardens. Her current work researches how community gardens are sites of resistance and can act as disruptors to the structures of power that maintain ecological crisis. Rosie contributed to the animation that is part of Anna's exhibition. She created the soundtrack in collaboration with Anna, which again we'll hear a bit more about in a moment. And last but not least, Helen Starr is here. Helen is an Afro-Indigenous Trinidadian world-building curator, commissioner, cultural activist, and founder of the Metrotronic Library. Her innovative practice establishes an Indigenous Carib epistemology for digital art, focusing on immersive media and AI technologies that express concepts such as gender fluidity, skin thinking, simultaneous multiple realities, and nature-godded words. So each of the panelists have come up with a few questions that we'll use to guide the conversation tonight, but we're also keen for this to be an open conversation, and we want to encourage you to ask questions throughout. So if you have anything you want to ask or any thoughts that you'd like to contribute, please just pop the question or the thought in the chat, or just kind of put your hand up and we can kind of hop to you at certain intervals. I think there'll kind of be some breaks in between the conversation where we might kind of invite some questions. So do get your thinking caps on and think about some questions to ask. So yes, I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit more about the sort of ideas and themes that we're going to be unpacking this evening. And I've got some slides as well to share to kind of share a bit more of her practice and the exhibition here at GHT. So over to you, Anna.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mia, for doing the slides and for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm going to begin with this brief introduction to Holding Space. It's going to be about 7 minutes, I reckon. There's some images here for those who haven't seen the show. Some of you may have been able to, but others may not have. Our focus this evening is on socially engaged art, and I am going to probably do this a lot this evening. I'm putting that in these scare quotes. This is a topic of conversation that's come into focus for me through the experience developing this project for God's House Tower. And it's been shaped by my collaborations with Rosie, who, as Mia mentioned, I met earlier this year through the open call that we put out to find an artist to work with me on the animation for the show. And also with Helen, who I realized via an open call that I applied for and responded to in 2017 for her project Worlds Among Us. And we've been working together in the years since then. And I'm really happy that they've both agreed to join me to explore this idea of socially engaged art, and also that we can open that conversation up with you in the audience. So this evening, we'll be thinking through our own practices, as well as drawing on our experience of collaborating with each other and with wider communities. And we'll unpack this definition of the socially engaged artist and explore how this form of practice is shaped by the cultural conditions in which we're working in the UK today. We also want to think about the potential of socially engaged practice as a form of activism in a wider, more international and intersectional sense, generating alternative models for how we might relate to each other and the worlds we share, perhaps towards less extractivist ways of working in community, and perhaps even creating new communities. So Holding Space was developed for God's House Tower as part of their climate action programme. From the initial proposal stage, I was keen to explore the dynamic between personal and collective political action. If we can go to the next slide, please, Mia. Getting slightly flashbacks to the COVID thing when you say that, but anyway, that's fine. I'll get over that. I took inspiration for this exhibition from the architecture of God's House Tower, a building with 2 galleries which viewers can navigate in a cyclical route in either direction. In the main gallery, which we saw in the first slide, the work invites more collective engagement, while in the project space seen here, a more intimate viewing experience allows the story of this animation to unfold in dialogue between the narrator and you, the viewer. Next slide, please. So the research for the project draws on a wider exploration of childlessness and my commitment to creating what I call fertile counter-narratives of this lived experience. I took the concept of reproductive refusal as a starting point for the works in the show. Reproductive refusal being at its most fundamental, the active decision not to bring children into the world, a personal choice that's often informed by environmental factors and is therefore, to my mind, an intimately political action. Environmental factors include most notably climate emergency, from anxiety about the future, life for any child born today, as well as concerns about the planetary impact of sustaining the highly destructive lifestyles of some of its most privileged beings, myself included. Other factors that inform reproductive refusal include the lived experience of settler colonialism in historical and contemporary cultures, as well as the conditions of life in late capitalist society, precarious work, high living costs, poor housing, isolation from communities of care, etc. Holding Space is not about promoting reproductive refusal as such, but I do want to invite self-reflection on the stakes of our embodied relation to our environment and the various forms of reproductive labour that we are engaged in. And with this work, I'm also trying to orient our imagination towards different ways of conceiving the future in the face of climate emergency. So if we go to the next slide, we'll return to the main gallery. And here you'll see this modular furniture in the space, which allows viewers to gather, as well as facilitating a changing display of research material and new work created by participants in a series of workshops, which I'll return to shortly. This form of installation was inspired by conversations that I've had with Helen over the years about the place of community programming within institutions, with socially engaged commissions often occupying a peripheral position alongside or kind of in augmentation to the main work in the gallery. So inspired by Helen's curatorial work, in particular, You Feel Me, a group exhibition that I was involved in with her at FACT in Liverpool, I wanted to make the site of gatherings and workshops and public engagement central to the exhibition. The design of the furniture also reflects conversations I had with Mia as the show developed about the material impact of exhibition making in general. The wastefulness of a temporary build, right down to the carbon footprint of screws, which Mia shared an amazing document with me. So I found out that aside from air travel, screws in temporary walls are one of the main sources of emissions in gallery exhibitions, which I found amazing. So this furniture was made in response to these conversations, created in collaboration with my partner's fabrication studio, Weber Industries, based in London, using leftover timber from, and other materials as well, from mainly this pavilion, public pavilion that he had built a couple of years ago outside Senate House in London. Designed to be modular and flat packable, the furniture kit will remain at GHT for future use. So if we go to the next slide, this was a really important outcome of the show, a kind of late addition, but really a meaningful thing to have created for me. And this is our environmental impact report. And I wanted to give, because I forgot on the opening night, a shout out to Izzy, who did a lot of the labour on this together with Mia. So I want that on record, counting a lot of the emails. So this report, which I think we're also going to share, it's linkable on the website, and I think we're also going to put it in the chat so it's a bit more accessible, but hopefully you can read it here. It details the impact of various aspects of the exhibition production. And kind of gives it a kind of carbon calculation and then some equivalents. So we might talk about this later, but something that was important in this for us was about really exploring the impact of these more intangible resources like app usage and cloud storage. These things also feature in the animation in the exhibition. And by taking account of the impact of our actions in making this show, we're then able to make more informed choices about how we want to work in the future. Paying attention as well to the fact that we sent 533 emails and spent over 18 hours on Zoom to plan this show, which is a modest show in the standards of kind of art practice seen in a broader scope, is also a really important reminder of the often invisible labour that goes into sustaining and making our practices visible. So I want to end, if we go to the next slide, just by speaking in a slightly more esoteric way, perhaps, about how I've imagined this exhibition unfolding in time and space, this spiral form. And this returns us as well to the dynamic of the personal and political that I began with earlier, and lands us back at this idea of socially engaged practice. The spiral image appears in the animation and is present too in other works in the show, like these ammonites that you can see in the installation image, as well as how I conceived of that cyclical route that a viewer would take through the gallery. It's this spiral, this spiral is the path that connects me to the world via my practice. Next image. Beginning with the first person perspective of the animation's narrator, who wonders what they might be holding space for you, perhaps. And this question with which the animation ends, opening up to a conversation with the viewer. The first viewer of this animation was Rosie, who developed her beautiful soundtrack alongside my work on the paintings, beginning with only the script and some rough sketches. And as we went along, her sound was folded into the world building process, informing the forms, the colors, and movements that began to take shape over time. Next slide. And once the work was on show, the spiral continued to expand through my collaboration with the small group who I'm meeting with regularly in the gallery space. We gather around the table in the main gallery to unpack some of the themes of the exhibition and respond creatively and expansively to this idea of reproductive refusal. Outcomes from the gatherings, this is an example from our last meeting. You can see Jane's outcome here, shown in detail. outcomes are added to the exhibition display, opening up the work to new perspectives. So this is a growing dialogue which generates new material and ideas that will inform future iterations of holding space, and which I hope may establish roots for ongoing connection after the exhibition closes later this month. So with that, I will hand over now to Rosie, who will introduce herself and speak a bit more about her practice.
Thank you. Just want to say as well, thank you for having me, Anna and Mia. And yeah, it's been a real privilege to work collaboratively with Anna on her animation. So thank you.
And for me too. So thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I'm an artist, a musician, and a horticulturalist. And in my practice, I use image and sound and plants as equal players to present entangled ideas, often working in collaboration with community groups, other gardeners, and other artists. And as it says here, through a range of participatory projects and workshops, I'm researching how acts of collective joy, noise and imagination can foster practices of care, connection and resistance in troubling times. Second slide, please, Mia. So this image is from a collaborative sound workshop called the Plants Talk Back. And I'm currently researching the social histories of community gardens in the UK, and thinking about how community gardening is a form of world building, where we might develop innovative approaches to climate change that are grounded in practical, scalable, and community-driven provocations and solutions. And when I say world building in this context, I'm talking about thinking through and creating immersive worlds that dramatize key sustainability challenges such as climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, mostly through conversations, making, composting, and through participatory workshops about alternative futures, space travel, role playing as animals and plants. Next slide, please. So I'm obsessed with gardens. Gardens are sites of constant disturbance and unpredictable renewal. The garden symbolises a synthesis of powerful ideas, wealth, class, colonial power relations, as well as forms of care, different experiences of time, and creative expression. And it's these multiple disturbances that make the garden a fertile place to think about world building as a tool for empowering reciprocal relationships, collective creativity, and community service. And I do really think world building can open up new possibilities as a powerful way to enter into a process of humans connecting with nature. And also, so for the novelist and gardener Jamaica Kincaid, these mixed disturbances allow the garden to hold multiple meanings at once. Oh, sorry, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. So these quotes are from two of my favourite gardeners / writers, and both quotes are encircling ideas around access. So access to nature and access to privilege, and they help me think through questions about who community spaces are for and what is at stake. The type of community gardens I work in are social spaces, collaborative, always in flux, and cared for by many people of many different backgrounds and walks of life. And they are hubs of food production, but also learning environments where sharing resources and working together, learning about careful stewardship of the environment and promoting well-being is equally as important as harvesting a good crop of carrots. And yeah, I think I'm really interested in community gardens as they're just good examples of people coming together and interacting whilst engaging in the creative, democratic roles of gardening and caretaking. And I do think that gardening is inherently creative. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to finish, this photo is from the Land Workers Alliance march that they did last month. And just a sort of final thought, in the UK, all green spaces, all gardens, whether public or privately owned, are interconnected through rhizomatic roots of entangled history. The transition from common to private land, formalised through the Enclosure Acts, intertwined both public and private gardens with one of the most radical shifts in political history, in British history. And often whilst gardening, I'm thinking through these ideas about land rights, enclosure, the idea that community gardens might be some sort of embryonic contemporary way of recommoning and restoring private land to public hands. And that is it.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. And now we're going over to Helen, who I hope is here. I can't see.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, fantastic. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, Anna. And I want to say it's been a real pleasure getting to know Mia and to be able to engage with Rosie's artistic practice as well. So I would say that I'm a Trinidadian world building curator, producer, and commissioner. Lately, much more of a commissioner than a curator. I've born to liberation activist of the Global South. I have lived both the structural and real violence of capital extraction and the genocide of my mother's people. I have sat in Marxist lecture halls alongside child soldiers and smelt the blood pouring from my gunshot uncles. I share this not to shock, but to expound on the differences between my Global South childhood and perhaps many of those of you who are with me here today. My ancestral past demands I take a sensory approach to my curatorial and commissioning work, which is at odds with the current world-dominating philosophy of humanism and its emphasis on Eurocentric knowledge structures. My practice is an offering up of a Carib epistemology, a less materially extractive way of being in the world, which centers a connected ecological framework in which we can understand that I is part of you, that you can never know me, but you can always feel me. I founded the Mechatronic Library in 2010 to commission diverse voices and untold stories within the emerging tech bro field of media art, which uses AI tools such as game engines, virtual reality, augmented reality simulations, etc., etc. I did this as a corrective and a cure to the dominant hegemon. Slide 2, please. The beautiful Danielle Braithwaite Shirley. This was an exhibition I curated and also commissioned 11 new commissions from. I was introduced to Danielle's practice by Anna, who recommended that I take a look at this rather brilliant student of hers. Thank you, Anna. And that's how I met and began working with Danielle. I would say that traditional Eurocentric communication methods, such as reading, lecturing, and debates, privileged a form of semantic knowing. These are favored by schools and universities across the world. Experiential and embodied learning, on the other hand, emphasizes learning through direct experience, action, and reflection. It involves bodily application of knowledge and an embodied understanding of being in the world. This is favored by galleries and museums And now after meeting Rosie, I'm going to have to add community gardens and gardeners. Of poesis, or the essence of poetry, which reveals knowledge as an unfolding truth between the liminal spaces of different languages. Next slide, please. What is special about this new sort of art form, which is particular to a world-building way of thinking, in that we literally have to build the worlds first, and then you experience the art afterwards. Imagine embarking on a profound intellectual journey where you traverse the vast terrain of knowledge and encounter diverse perspectives. Alongside you is a cybernetical companion, an artist AI avatar. The avatar becomes your trusted guide, co-present throughout this transformative quest. As you navigate through different cultures and unfamiliar worlds, the artist AI avatar assumes the role of a linguistic bridge. She or they or it possesses the remarkable ability to facilitate communication, breaking down barriers of language and enabling you to engage with a myriad of voices, histories, and ways of difference. Next slide, please, Mia. This companion serves as more than a mere AI entity. She embodies the principles of a non-didactic learning and experiential engagement. Together, you and the artist avatar embark on a rewilding journey, forming a symbiotic partnership rooted in exploration and discovery. The partnership nurtures an appreciation for the diversity of human thought, enabling you to embrace alternative perspectives and amplify the voice of other and othered communities. Next slide, please. This image is part of an upcoming futuristic time-traveling world-building project by the queer feminist artist, Iraqi artist, Sarah al-Sarraj. It poignantly narrates the impending disappearance of the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq and their ancient culture, which centuries ago was knowledgeable enough to introduce Asiatic lions to maintain the region's ecological balance. The last known Asiatic lion was killed in 1918 in the Lower Tigris region, marking the end to species that had been native, that had become indigenous to the origin. Although detailed accounts of the lion's death are sparse, its extinction is a significant event in Iraqi cultural and wildlife history, symbolizing a broader pattern of ecological change. In his quest for oil, in his quest to maintain growth and power within the world, the late ruler Saddam Hussein, who was put into power by the Americans, drained the southern Iraqi marshlands. This action, now compounded by climate change, has destroyed the once thriving ecosystem. And it seems as if the lives and the culture of the marsh Arabs are about to soon end. Despite all of our advancements of modern science, this ecocidal event is proving to be irreversible. I'll end us with a quote from my beloved Sylvia Wynter, a Jamaican philosopher who has thought really long and hard for many years about all of these complex issues. And she says here, you see our origin stories that have implemented themselves, more likely have been result of a relation between affliction and cure. The affliction of natural sin was given the cure of a celibate clergy, and the affliction of natural scarcity was given the cure of economics and Darwinian notions of the descent of man. But these are all simply stories. The affliction of today is one concerned with who we are and the need for a we. The question is, what will be the cure? That is when the third event becomes important, you see, because it is a recognition that we are all a species, but not in the manner we have been accustomed to, that we can narrate this problem in a different way. End.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I think we're going to put a link to that text into the chat if people are interested to read that interview with Sylvia Winter that Helen was drawing on there. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have now a good sense of kind of who everyone is and where we're speaking from. And to open up the conversation, I want us to build on these introductions as a starting point, and for us to think about what we mean when we say socially engaged art practice. I was interested that world building was kind of coming up. I made a little note in all of us kind of thinking about it in different ways. But thinking also about this idea of each of us in our different practices as being socially engaged. What does it mean to think of ourselves as artists, as gardeners, as curators in this way? And for myself, I was reflecting on the fact that when this term socially engaged practice is used, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think it's often used in the context as if the artist is engaging with a community from the outside. So it's not really thinking about them as maybe emerging as part of that community, but it's about them being brought in. They're this separate being that is engaging with this kind of mass of the community. And for me, that really forgets the fact that an artist, and I think we've all touched on it in different ways, emerges as part of a community, and that our practice is always shaped by relations, by social forces. It's always socially engaged, to my mind. So the question for us to open with is, how do each of you understand yourself as socially engaged? And who or what forms the community that is shaping your current practice? So Helen, I think we will start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you, Anna. Actually scripted my response, so I wouldn't waffle. I wanted to talk about movements, traditional artistic movements that have always existed, like surrealism, and artists like the amazing Maria Martins, who until quite recently had been deleted from the archive, apart from this reference to her being the love interest and mistress of Marcel Duchamp. It is Maria's raped body that we see in Marcel Duchamp's massive work, Étant Donné. This is after she rejected the greatness of Duchamp. But Maria was a Brazilian visual artist who was particularly well known for her modern sculptures. Martins carved her early figures from the subtropical jacaranda tree, which is native to Brazil. Jacaranda's straight grain and relatively soft, knot-free properties made it ideal for sculpting. Maria chose this specific wood also to resonate with the Brazilian themes of her work. Her 1939 work, Macumba, references the underground Afro-Brazilian religion, imagery that she frequently references in subsequent works. Martin's association with the 1940 expatriate art community in New York helped formulate her view on art's political power. These views on art, its role in peace, and the responsibility of artists were articulated in an essay that was read into the US Congressional Record on June 18, 1947. Impossible for us to imagine today that someone would stand in Congress or stand in a political forum and read the words of an artist. So it was read by Congressman Jacob Javits of New York. In the essay, which was entitled Art, Liberation and Peace, she describes a world in which differences of race, nationalities, religions, social conditions, and opinions are frequently discussed, thereby negating the impacts of politics and wealth. She highlighted that Adolf Hitler's destruction of works of art as the beginning of his nihilistic drive of conquest, domination, and destruction. She describes art as an appeal to the emotions, a liberation, and is immortal, emphasizing that art's value is to mobilize human beings to counter the impacts of horror, such as those that come to us through war. So this would be my response, would be that artists have always been activists. We've just sort of forgotten that, and we've lost a lot of our power. I think mainly through the market forces, where we've become focused on generating money.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great start. Okay, Rosie, over to you, thinking about how you understand yourself as socially engaged and these communities that are shaping your practice.
Yeah, I think what Helen said about this idea of like power is really central, actually. I guess for me, socially engaged practice should be one that takes direction from the needs and wants of the community that the artist is working with or is part of. And yeah, it gives power to the people in that community to get involved and test their creative ideas. And it should be collaborative, not just an artist sort of landing like a spaceship and telling people what to do. And I think communities are shifting and different and multiple. And where I live, I've talked about this with people like other artists who kind of share the community where I live, and there's an ecosystem of artists and cultural organisations, be they galleries, museums, gardens, and they're joined up through the people that use them and use their services. So that forms a community as well. And then for me as well, there's plant communities, insect communities, microbial communities. But yeah, I guess I think about my work as a socially engaged artist is about finding out what the needs of my community are and working out who my community is.
Thank you. I think it's interesting as well when I was thinking about this for myself, maybe mostly in the context of this project, because this is the first kind of public outcome of this exploration I've been doing of this idea of these fertile counter narratives of childlessness. And I was thinking a lot about, I guess we have this idea of kind of responding to an existing community, which I think both of you have picked up on. And then I think there's also something there about like the potential of communities that are yet to be built. And I think there's something interesting you were saying, Helen, in that quote about conversation as kind of addressing these differences and allowing us to kind of really engage them rather than sort of repress them or try and flatten them. And I think that there is something really powerful in these different practices. I think, well, that's for me what a world building practice is conjuring maybe this sense of community that doesn't yet exist, as well as responding perhaps to what is already there. Maybe those two things need to be, one is the kind of like composting one and making that the kind of nurture the other. So for me, that's just something I was thinking about specifically with something around childlessness, which may be a form of sociality that actually people do not want to be drawn towards. Like it is a quite contingent community, and it's one that is, because of this, it's framing in the negative, which I lean into and other people don't, and maybe use other terms, child-free or other ways of thinking. There is something quite interesting about there's a sense of community perhaps that is required to be created, and that's something I'm very interested in. And in the work on this project, it's very relevant to me around kind of the community shaping current practice. I was wanting to kind of put, and maybe I'll put this into the chat as well, about Jodie Day, who's done a lot of work with community building for childless and child-free people in an international way using kind of digital forms. So that was something that was really inspiring to me. Wonderful. Okay, so I think we're going to, I think Rosie, just building on what you were kind of ending with there, I wanted to come back to a question that you had raised for us, which I think really is useful in kind of unpacking this idea of the socially engaged artist. And you asked us, what happens when we broaden the definition of an artist to include community organisers, participants, volunteers, activists, educators, and others involved in the creative process? So do you want to speak a bit more about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I asked that question because I don't know the answer. So I'm just like really interested to hear what you think. But I suppose my kind of feeling about what I think is sometimes a quite prohibitive title, especially in this kind of current economic climate, you know, where university fees are completely impossible, and I just don't think you need to have been to art school in order to call yourself an artist. And I think if you broaden out that kind of definition, it challenges the status quo, and it engages people in conversation, and it's empowering. But that's sort of my thoughts about it. But what do you think?
Well, I was just going to ask you, is that something that you kind of put into practice in your, I mean, I'm wondering about, for example, thinking about, you mentioned about like the plants as collaborating, you mentioned this kind of like flattening, this kind of the plants are actors kind of in this scene. And I'm just interested in sort of, are there ways that you can work with, maybe the garden, especially as a way of kind of drawing that out, like giving people permission. I think that's something that I'm very aware of, is kind of sometimes that is what's needed, like permission for someone to do that. So I wondered if you could, or if you wanted to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, the idea of kind of, I feel like that often, you know, if I'm in a space that I feel somehow not entitled to be in, or I don't know enough, you know, you need someone to sort of say, you should be here, you're welcome here, you can engage with this, what do you think? And I actually think in kind of a community art context, that's so important. And I think in terms of working in gardens, there's this kind of balance of work, maybe like this idea that, I'm the gardener, but like actually the worms in the compost are like working way harder than me right now. It's interesting. What does Helen think?
So I guess the thing is, one of the things that's really, that I always struggle with is the actual word artist. So we want to really, so I always think from, obviously, because I'm from the global south, I think from the perspective of the global south, where we don't have anything like the Arts Council, and we don't have an art market, right? These are things that belong to the global north. And yet to say that there are no artists in the global south makes a nonsense of the word artist. So the thing I always think about is, well, how do we do it? And I would say as a Trinidadian, that we are really great at participatory artistic practices, and our big explosion of artistic expression comes every year through our carnival, which is, I keep going back to the word participatory, which is an open invitation to any and everyone. You can participate in the spiritual part of our practice as an equal covered in mud that you take from the ground. And there's so many levels at which you can participate that come from you can wear a tree as a costume, or you can buy a costume. And that's how we fund the whole thing. And I would say in Trinidad, I mean, one of the jokes when we had a major coup and the country was on military alert, what stopped it was a Calypsonian came out with a song saying, wait, guys, but what about Carnival? And then the whole country realized that we weren't going to have a carnival. And that was like an impossible thought. It just emerges from the people. However, I will say that there are cultural workers who shape the carnival. And there would be the equivalent of what I see as a professional artist or someone in academia. You have academics who may shape the narrative for a band. So you have people who get paid for their special roles, and they're more, I guess, like cultural guides and cultural, yeah, I'd say they're guides for the people, but it's something that is open to everyone, and it can't be cut. There can't be cuts to it because it's not controlled. The money isn't controlled by a political entity. So I would say that if we start thinking about other models and other different models of ways in which we can practice as artists, that the socialist model would be one that I would like to offer to this conversation, and to not be afraid of standing up and saying we deserve to be paid for this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to get rid of this idea of the artist with the begging bowl, which I think is pervasive within Anglo culture and is to the heart of the problem, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And that's something that we're going to pick up on in our next load of questions. Before we open up for questions and comments from the audience, so if anyone wants to add anything, please make a note in the chat now, and then I think we can also come to you. It'd be lovely to hear a bit of input and have a bit of a break for you to chip in if you wanted to ask anything or comment. But I was just kind of enclosing this bit, and I think it's very relevant actually to this idea of these kind of spaces and times and permissions. I'm interested in the carnival as well, like the garden as being this kind of bounded sort of, you know, it's this bounded space time where things can play out. And there's this kind of permission bound up in that. And I sent it actually to Rosie on Instagram because I saw this Catherine Baum commission for the showroom, which people might have seen. It's a new public artwork that the showroom have developed. It's from a series of collaborative workshops around this question, why do we care about art? And the final banner, or the one that I saw on Instagram, and I haven't seen it in real life, it has the word, a kind of collaborative slogan, if you like, which is replace the word art with freedom to do things. And I just thought that was a really nice kind of response in a way to what Rosie was proposing. And I think this question, like this not knowing, is actually a really rich place to start from with that. I think like even the question of like, what if we broaden this definition? Like that's a really great place, I think, for us to start doing our work. So, so yeah, does anyone, Mia, have we got anything in the chat that anyone wants to ask, or people can unmute, I guess?
Yeah, we have some thoughts from Dave. I think it was around the presentations, but maybe Dave, can I just hand over to you? Do you want to any of your kind of thoughts that you want to wrap up, or any question you might have?
Yeah, not a question, but just a kind of amusing on what Helen was talking about. Mentioned that the idea that there are because of the lack of an Arts Council equivalent, there are no artists in the Global South. She said that's ridiculous. And I have to agree, given that I'm in a room, my study, which apart from the books behind me, is largely filled with artworks, many of which come from non-European, non-Western sources. So there are definitely artists out there, because I have some of their works and it's lovely. That was it. It just sprung to mind. I thought, well, yeah, look. I would show you, but I can't.
Thanks, Dave. We also have a question in the chat from Richard for Helen. I'm interested in your two opposing models of support for art. The socialist one, unless I misheard, and the begging bowl. Can you expand on those two?
So I think we have a question about the funding for the arts that's coming up. So once Anna poses that question, I'll be able to respond clearly with what I with an example of what I see.
That's
Cool.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard's put great, thanks. So ready for the next part of the conversation, I think. I'll keep an eye on the chat. So
Wonderful.
if any questions, please do pop them in there and we'll get to them in a mo.
Great. Thank you. I will also say that there is a storm rolling in. So if you hear thunder, that's what that sound is. So sorry about that if nature intervenes, but I can't help it. Our next set of questions, we're going to begin following up from Richard's question. Our next set of questions are concerned with how our work as artists is shaped by cultural conditions and its potential role in reshaping culture. And so, Rosie, when we were talking in the lead up to this, you were interested and you touched on it in your beautiful green map, which I love, interested in exploring how class informs this idea of socially engaged practice and how we undertake that as cultural workers in the UK today. So we're going to start with your question. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that and expand on it, or I can just read the question as you prefer?
Just go into the question.
Okay, great. I'm going to read out Rosie's question. When seeking funding for the arts, especially for participatory or open-ended projects, I often feel pressured to fit my work into specific criteria, omit important details, or predict outcomes prematurely to meet funders' requirements. How can this process be improved? What would be a better or ideal way to distribute money to artists? So it's a great question, lots there, and it really picks up on what Richard was expanding on in his question. So yeah, maybe I'm thinking, Helen, we'll start with you. You have a lot of experience of mentoring and commissioning artists. So maybe, yeah, we hand over to you first.
Yeah, so I'm going to just be really radical here. So one of the things that really irritates me is how value is assigned by politicians and economists. And what I mean by this is when we look at industries which rely on artistic production to distribute content that people will pay for, such as speakers, headsets, televisions, laptops. These businesses bring value to economies and yet are not seen as part of the wider artistic ecosystem. Chip manufacturing companies, I have a specific example. If we take a chip manufacturing company, such as NVIDIA, which last year, in 1 year, brought in 30 billion US dollars in net income. The whole purpose of that chip is to distribute. 60% of what it distributes is artistic output. And yet we don't automatically get a share or a cut of that 30 billion a year from that one company. If we as artists, and I'm talking about all artists, musicians, poets, visual makers, if we refused our labor, we refused to let companies which make huge amounts selling televisions or speakers or headsets, we say, no, you can't use our content without our permission, all of those massive business industries would collapse. And yet, when we present ourselves to politicians or to economists, we go as if they're doing us a favor when we are literally the source of generating so much income for so many countries. So when we talk, or when I think about this sort of huge structural change that needs to come, this is what I mean. If we say, why don't all the things that use artistic content give, and all the companies that benefit from artists give 10% of their income to the Arts Council, we would see the most massive swelling in the coffers of the Arts Council. And then that money would just flow back through the entire system. So it's not that the money isn't there, it's how it's distributed. And it's the story or narrative that's taught at an economic level through the separation of how we think of industry and these industries which are benefiting our labor. So to answer your question, Richard, about is state funding equal to begging, we shouldn't be begging. They should just be grateful because we're generating all of this income for the country. I mean, I don't get it. I'm just like, we should riot and just burn everything down. Sometimes is how I feel. Sorry. Just burn it down. Give the world a taste of what it's like to not have artists, and then start renegotiating from that perspective. That's quite radical.
Before I go to Rosie, I was wondering, Richard, did you want to respond? You're welcome to unmute or type away. Save your fingers. That's what me and my mum call it when you stop typing and just.
Yeah, hi. I will come on mic just because to be sociable. I don't have a response, especially, but I wanted to say thanks to Helen. Yeah, I guess it was the terminology. So the term begging bowl, I think, is what you used, Helen. And I was just curious, what constitutes begging and what doesn't, because I guess in my kind of activism, which I'm not going to go into here, discourse around state funding is often framed that way, in a highly negative sense for artists.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm not implying there's not a criticism of your framing of it there. It's just, I don't know, I just find it a really fascinating, irresolvable question for the moment. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't a response, but I'll leave you to it.
It is a response. It's great. And I think there is something really interesting about going back to that Sylvia Wynter quote, Helen, about this idea of it's the story we tell, right? And I think that there is something, maybe before I go to Rosie, my response was much more mundane. Well, I actually had two. One, which was a question, I feel like it already exists, but I just haven't experienced it. And the first one I had this idea of the better way to improve this process of funding is very boring, which is universal basic income, which is a very, I mean, it's an existing kind of exploration. And I think it's been trialed in Ireland, I believe, and I've not, to be honest, been following how that's been going. But I think it really connects with the previous question around this idea of the artist as a kind of professional, and shifting to something that it would change fundamentally the dynamics between an artist and a community if everyone was in receipt of a universal basic income that did not require applications the ability to kind of access these incredibly complex forms and articulate oneself within this very particular parameter, and also to not be in competition with each other for these things, but to allow us to take back in some way some of that space and time, which would give us the permission. I think one of the most crushing things as an artist is constantly, I'm speaking here from very personal experience, constantly having one's confidence undermined because you can't make a living from what you do, so you devalue it. Of course, that privileges people who have don't need to work for their living to pay their rent and to pay for their, materials and to pay for their train fares and to pay for gallery tickets to see other artists work as part of their research. This is, we know this perpetuates these class issues within cultural practice, and we're seeing the sharp end of government policy in this country that has devastated arts provision in what I call normal schools, which is state schools, non-fee paying schools. So this for me, this universal basic income touches on some of these things. And also for me, I was thinking about this lack of empowerment as well, about our lives. And there's something about, if this universal basic income could make a life livable, then of course we would have a sense of empowerment back around how we use our time. And that's something that was my response, which is kind of basic, but also it's radical, but it's also not my idea. I think other people were commenting in the chat, so I'm keen to open up to that. But maybe Rosie, do you want to be nice to hear from you, since you asked this wonderful question, and then we can open it up to some comments.
Well, thank you. The universal basic income one is really interesting, because I think there's like a kind of, maybe actually this almost like what Helen was saying, there's like this political narrative that like if you were to give everyone UBI, people would just be lazy and they wouldn't do anything. But I think maybe that the tests that they've done, the one in Ireland and maybe like Sweden or something, is actually completely the opposite. Like people get really involved in their communities and they end up doing loads of like amazing stuff. And yeah, it's obviously a great idea in my opinion. I think I asked that question because I've and I think, Anna, we were talking about this a bit as well, this kind of idea of like, as an artist, you're always applying for stuff and you're always being rejected from things, and it's just part of the ongoing sort of thing that happens. And like recently, I was paid to pitch on a commission, which doesn't happen very often. And actually it made me think, wow, that's amazing. I've been paid to pitch regardless of whether I get the commission or not, just because of the amount of time and energy that those kind of applications take. But then it sort of made me think, well, that's just how it should be anyway, because I'm working. And then the next thing that happened was that I didn't get the commission, and the feedback was that because I'd proposed participatory workshops to form the ideas of this sort of sound piece and film for the funders, it was kind of they couldn't get their head around it, and they couldn't fund it because the output wasn't clear, so they didn't know what it would look like in the end. But that was all part of it because it was participatory workshops, so of course they didn't know, because I didn't know. So it's this kind of almost cyclical thing of, an artist does things that they don't always know the outcome. It's always well researched. Well, usually it's well researched, and it almost feels like you're always on the back foot a little bit in that kind of situation. So that was, I was just interested to know what.
Absolutely. And I think that experience of yours in terms of the response to that, the response, I think, really shows as well how these funding models, these narratives, also perpetuate a very particular kind. It closes down some of the possibilities that we're talking about, that's structured in, you know what I mean? It's like, if you only need to deliver a product, as like I've proposed it, I've delivered it, and here it is. And then this comes back also to the conversation I've been having with Helen for a long time. On the side of that commissioning in a gallery, then would need to be the widening participation program that would bring the community into this to look at this project. You know what I mean? So I think that that's really interesting and indicative of how these things kind of nurture particular types of practice and make other ones kind of impossible to imagine in the current conditions that we're in. I should add, before Mia comes in and says, it's something that I commented on right at the beginning. This is a model that GHT and A-Space, I think, more widely use for their proposals of funding, the funding applicants to develop the proposal for the open call. That was my experience working with them, and it was something that was completely a new to me and a very welcome kind of shift. And so I think that in terms of practice, I hope becomes more
I think I've had that twice now, and the first time I was like, what? This is amazing. So I think it's really important actually, because it just underlines the importance and the time and effort that's put into these things.
So I have something to say about universal income. This is only possible if the global north keeps extracting at the rate. If it increases its extractive relationship with the global south, then you get your money for the universal global income, right? Because you're thinking about it as extra money coming in. So I would say I would agree with the universal income if it was taken from companies that only made their money within the global north. So a good example is cobalt mining. The actually largest deposits of cobalt are in Canada, but the reason that they're mined for in the Congo is because you don't have to put in the care resources for the people in the Congo, and that's why our phones are so cheap, right? So the reason we have phones that we can recycle every year or every 2 years and get new ones is based on the labor of children in the Congo. It's not that the minerals don't exist in the global north. So when we're talking about ecological thinking and we're thinking about this lovely idea of an income which just deposits in everyone's bank account that is outside of what is what's called public goods, which is that everyone has use of roads. Roads are built. You don't have to pay. Well, in America, you have to pay for your roads, right, separately. But in the UK, you don't pay for your roads, right? That is something everyone can use, and it's considered a community resource, right? The roads that you drive all of your cars on actually paved by pitch that all comes from Trinidad, which no one ever seems to realize that every single road in Europe is paved by Trinidadian pitch, which we really are not paid for, right? So when you're thinking about how money is distributed, we also really need to think very carefully about the source that money comes from and what we want to give up, right? Because we can't keep constantly being extractive if we want to live in an equitable world. I think one of the enormous wonders of Anna's project, which is about reducing childcare, is the simple fact that an average American family of 4 uses as much energy as a family with 17 kids in the global south, right? So this to me becomes this is a fair exchange. So the exchange is you give up having as many children, right? So we really need to think, when we're thinking about constantly wanting more money. And this goes to another question that comes up later about this idea of degrowth, which I'm a big fan of, is, well, just thinking really carefully before we think about just giving everyone universal income, because where's that money coming from? Ooh.
Thank you, Helen. I want to go to some comments and questions from people. I think what you said there is really important in terms of we think of, I suppose, universal basic income bound by the nation state, right? And your NVIDIA example is a fantastic example of how extractive economics works to extract all these minerals, locate the company somewhere, sell on a market, and, you know, everyone can mine their bitcoins and make their animations using an NVIDIA chip, as I have. They're beautiful animations. Yeah, I think that that's a really, it comes back to this question also of sort of what is the community that we're thinking about? This idea of a universal basic income not being bounded to, you know, Ireland. Ireland being also an interesting example of where a lot of these international tax dodging companies base themselves, offering services, cloud services. Anyway, yeah, so thank you. That's a great point. Let's go to...
And also just to point out that I am in this field. I work with AI technologies, which are extractive. So how do I situate myself within this discussion when my entire practice is about engaging with the very same technologies that I critique all the time? And the answer to that is going back to your beautiful document, which is it's a trade-off, right? What is the cost of an animation as compared to shipping a sculpture across the world? With your beautiful animation, Anna, which we've just agreed to disseminate across the world, which is so exciting for me. It means for very little energy, I can send that work to my friends and family in Trinidad. They don't have to pay for it. They can engage with it, right? They don't have to pay the £17 for a cinema ticket, which, right? So there is no absolute. Sort of what I'm saying is we shouldn't be thinking in absolutes. We should be thinking in terms of structure, and we should be thinking in terms of how to make things better. The global north will always use more energy because the north has winter, right? And that's not what we're saying in the global south. You know, I grew up with my parents just talking about it. It's like, oh, well, the reason they're so extractive, it's because they're so cold and they always live with this fear that winter's coming and they're going to starve to death. Whereas for us,
sorry, go on.
No, it's just like, whereas for us, it's like, oh, well, you'll never die of cold. And really, you just can go into the forest, you can throw seeds into the ground anytime and pull food out. So it's very easy for us to sit in the global south and think, well, we're not extractive and we're not warlike because the environment enables just a gentler way of being. So this is also what I wanted to.
Thank you.
say.
Okay, sorry, we've got a bit overexcited, and I know there were lots of comments in the chat, so let's open up now. No more, Rosie and Helen, be quiet. No.
Yeah, there are lots of comments.
Let's go.
Just thinking about different kind of models of funding, I had a message from Dave who spoke a bit about Lucky Dip. So one of A-Space's project is called Lucky Dip, and it's a kind of different way of funding artists to make new work. And it's an idea that Dave and another local artist, Sarah Filmer, sort of came up with and passed on to us. And we've kind of developed into this project, which we've been running for the last few years.
Yeah, somewhat ironically, it came up while the two of us were sat on the wall, like the little ledge bit on the wall outside God's House Tower, moaning about how much work you have to put in to even apply for funding.
Well, there we go.
So yeah, we basically the idea that Dave and Sarah came up with, we put into action, and we've asked artists within the SO postcode to kind of put their names in a hat, basically. The questions that we ask are how do you consider yourself to be an artist, and we keep it kind of really open about what projects they want to kind of fund, and then we pick 10 names out of a hat, and we give £500 to each of the artists to make a bit of work. So in an attempt to kind of really break down all of those barriers and literally make a selection a lucky dip, which kind of has enabled so much really interesting work, and work that actually was kind of in an experimental phase where before you're able to write it down and put it into an application to go to funding, sometimes you just need 500 quid to realise an initial idea before you're ready for that. So yeah, thinking through kind of different ways of funding, I think, and putting those into action. We're kind of privileged to be a national portfolio organisation, so we have a kind of structure that enables us to test these things out. But I'm sure there are artists everywhere with really interesting radical ideas about the way we can kind of deal with funding, which I hope kind of we can find some more support for. And then there's kind of a couple of questions. So there was a comment from Gemma on funding. I run a community art space, and to fund it, I'm feeling the pressure to fill gaps in health services in order to be able to fund it. I absolutely believe that art is central to all kinds of health, but feel very leery about the long-term agenda. On the question of who is an artist, I wish we could depart from seeing art as a separate, rarefied pursuit. We are innately creative and have been alienated by commerce. It's making us poorly. Gemma, I don't know whether you want to expand on that at all, or the panel, if you have any thoughts about that.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. My video doesn't work, but obviously my mic does.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'd just be really interested to know what you all think about that. I'm facing a lot of difficult decisions about funding. I work with Rosie a lot, so she knows the space. There is a lot of pressure to provide social prescribing, and I'm really interested in it. It's kind of what we do anyway. But needing to use all that in a more structured way in order to be able to pay for what we do. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Thank you so much also for bringing in the whole discourse of social prescription. I think it's a really important thing to the conversation. So thank you for that. Rosie, maybe do you want to respond? That would be...
Hi, Gemma. I think, I don't know what I think about social prescribing, to be honest, because there's a community garden that I work in sometimes, and their kind of funding model is based on social prescribing, and they don't have the stress of having to constantly reapply for funding in the way that Gemma's space does, and lots of art spaces do. And I think in that sense, it can be a thing that brings stability for people who might have mental health needs and sort of special educational needs. And yeah, to me, that's a good thing. I think if it supports the longevity of organisations that people rely on, like seriously rely on, that's kind of, I don't know, Gemma and I actually talk about this kind of stuff a lot.
To pick up on that, Rosie, the drawback of it is that everybody, do you remember when we made the film there? And there were people who wanted to go to the garden, but they had to have a PIP to be allowed to go to the garden or have enough money to pay for it. And most of the people who were working with it didn't. So it meant we were excluded, which is really shit. And obviously, you know that the space that I run, the point of it is that it's open and it's free. And the end so it's tricky.
I feel like both need to exist. I think that community garden that you're talking about, where that was exclusionary, but it's a lifeline for the people that do use it and do use social prescribing. So yeah, it's a really difficult one. I think it's about £40 a day.
Right.
That is, yeah, comes out of their PIP money.
Yeah.
Um,
To get tips for people, and obviously you've like educational needs and things, it can be really, really difficult.
yeah.
So number one, I know Anna Jo's been trying to say something.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things coming up. Jo was talking about the idea of artists going on strike after, I think, Helen, you were talking about what if all artists just stopped making work,
Yeah.
and how everything would just collapse. So Jo was saying if Iceland's women could coordinate a strike of domestic labour, why not the world's artists? It may well get a result. Richard then hopped in and said the strikes in Hollywood seem to set some kind of precedent. We'll see. And Jo said, I was thinking just that. And then Jo, I think you wanted to speak a bit about universal basic income. So I'll hand over to you.
I did. I'm really sorry. My children have just come in to say goodnight.
Oh, good night.
So if you could just give me 2 minutes, I'll be
right.
I wanted to say as well, I don't know if you know this, Anna, but I was part of the team that won the Wolfson Prize for Economics, which is the largest prize for economics outside of the Nobel Prize. So that was pretty cool. Your work's actually in the proposal on my list of things to tell you. But the prize the year we won it was looking at health care predictions in the UK and in Europe, and how we're going to get ready. And so the prize is to create releases £250,000 to do research on what's going to happen in the UK and wider Europe, because we're facing something called compression, in that we're looking at an aging population, and people are living longer, but we're not able to get as many nurses. So you have this huge compression issue that's happening. And the project I was involved with, which was run by Abe Rogers, and we actually won it, was about embedding hospitals within communities. So rather than these giant hospitals that are really quite clinical and horrible, you would have almost like the hospital becomes a community center, and the hospital that Abe designed, these are not giant structures with many floors. These are small floors. The ground space is given open for community markets. It's based on this idea of lots of gardening, the windows of the hospitals open, so to get rid of the hospital smell that we all hate. And the project was basically about embedding artistic practice into the hospitals of the future. And to give you an idea of why I rage so much when you're thinking about politicians and economics, is that the reason that all the hospitals in the UK are so dark, so that we need artificial light in all the hospitals, is that it was decided that the front of the hospitals, where the windows are, should be all aligned away from the sun, because the sun damages facades and windows are expensive to repair. So all the hospitals in the UK are aligned to face away from the sun, which is why they're all dark, because that was an economic, political decision. And of course, the people who made that decision didn't talk to any doctors who would have told them that natural light has healing properties. So these are these huge economic decisions that are being made without artistic input, and then they get rolled out, and then they cause so much wider damage. And so really thinking about these macro structures, this becomes really important, and not having the solution that we'll import our nurses from the third world or the global south to solve the problem, because guess what? Countries in the global south need their nurses. So these solutions, right? This is all, anyway, that was a whole artistic led project, Anna, and we won. So we'll see new types of care hopefully coming in with Centre the Arts.
It's a very generous use of the word we in terms of including me in that, but congratulations. My image did indeed appear in the PDF, and I'm very grateful for that. Joe, if you want to come in, it would be really nice to hear from you.
Sorry, did you say Joe? I didn't quite
Yes.
catch that. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry about that. Thank you for being patient. Yeah, I was really interested in all of it, really. Firstly, the idea of going on strike as an artist. I'm actually a filmmaker, but I work specifically on films for social positive change. And the idea of artists actually striking and withdrawing their labour, I think, would possibly be the only way for people to really realise how much art is in their life and how valuable it is to everybody. It's how we have our downtime, it's how we regulate our mental health, it's how we express ourselves, it's how we make sense of the world to ourselves. It's absolutely vital to our life, and I just don't think most people understand that. Just a note on Richard's point about the writers' strike in the States. You may or may not be aware of this, but the impact of that on the television sector in the UK, where a lot of my colleagues work, about 75% of people working in television at the moment are unemployed, 75%, as a knock-on effect of that. So that's a pretty big impact. So secondly, I won't take up too much time, but just on the universal basic income, I find it a really interesting idea, and I love the idea of everybody being given sort of a basic kind of base level, which they can do with what they want. The thing that concerns me is that we don't all start from a level playing field. So you're raising the level, but you're not raising everybody by the same amount. So I grew up with a father with quite severe disabilities, and he needed equipment. You know, he needed what do you call them, crutches, and then he needed a wheelchair, and then he needed an electric wheelchair and a hoist and all these kind of equipment. It all costs a lot of money. And what makes me concerned is that with basic income, the people who do need a bit of extra help, and that might be just disabled people, it might be people from other minority groups within society, may not get the help that they need, and they would still be lagging behind other people in the mainstream. So I would like to see what the scheme would do to make sure that we do all have equal opportunities and access to the world in general.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such an important point as well around, yes, you're absolutely right that if that is to come in without broader structural change around inherited wealth and provision of care and linking to that how, and what Helen was talking about earlier with hospitals and the way that we treat, and going back to the PIP and the social prescription, how little respect we have for our care workers who are doing the most important roles in our society. How, yeah, unlivable we make the life of people who are perhaps traveling from other parts of the world to work and are not welcome to bring their families, for example. Yes, basically it could only work as part of much broader structural change. Otherwise, you're right, it becomes a kind of it's like pin money. Do you know what I mean? It might be a basis for some people, but for other people it would entrench those. So thank you. That's really important. Great. Helen, did you want to come in? And then I'm thinking we should have another look at the chat, because there's a few. It would be nice.
Sure.
Did you want to say anything though, Helen, before we do that?
No, we can go in for the next question, which I think is mine.
Yeah.
There's just a few bits in the chat. I just wonder, there's some thoughts from Richard, and then we've got a question from Ruth as well. So maybe I'll just read Richard's out. So Richard said, yes, I think the idea of livable life is the big one, and art can be a much wider part of that, allowing everyone a chance to do more sport or gardening or whatever we want. Art as an output really aligns with art as product. In the UK, arts funding mirrors market logics, unfortunately, like most other things. Helen, I know that you've spoken about that. We chatted a bit about that before we hopped on this call. And then Richard again is just agreeing about universal basic income. What would matter would be the implementation and the welfare context it exists within. Another related idea is universal basic services, e.g. extending free bus services to everyone. I don't know whether, Richard, you want to speak to any of those thoughts. If you do, please do speak up and turn off your mic, and then we'll move to Ruth's question, and then maybe we'll hop back. Richard, is there anything you wanted to follow up on, or are you just happy for those thoughts to kind of...
No, sorry, I was trying to use the chat as a way of not taking up space.
You're invited to, Richard. This is a holding space situation.
But thank you for asking.
Great. Ruth, oh, mine isn't a question, lol, that's great. Not a question, more of a comment is also very welcome. Do you want to unmute, Ruth, or we can just read out your comment?
Oh.
Hello.
Yeah, hopefully this is going to work. I'm in the park.
Oh, lovely. That looks gorgeous background.
Yeah, I've got the Southampton clock tower behind me over here. I don't see it anyway.
Amazing.
my room's very, very hot. So here I am in the park. I was really into what people were saying about the social prescribing and that like tension. I've been looking at doing a project around making prints from different access aids. I use a stick and I use cushions, and I started printing with them. And then people, some of the funding you can get with it is like, the social prescribing is really focusing on. I've attended things that have social prescribing. I've did a really amazing thing called Nature Ease, and I loved it. But there was also a lot of restrictions, like you weren't supposed to talk about all your problems outside, which in the one hand was good because it gave you that mental break. I mean, I didn't have proper housing at the time, and like it was good to not like hear everyone else's problems and always talk about your problems. But it also limits what you can do creatively, because you can't move beyond sort of well-being into like, well, what's causing all these problems? And so as a sort of, when I'm doing stuff creatively and I have an idea for a project, I find it quite limiting from that side of things. I've been doing stuff so interesting that there's a lot of stuff about community gardens coming up today, because a lot of my stuff been doing around that, but we've been doing something in allotments, and we got some creative tech funding, and it's allotments that community allotments I've been involved in, but really what we wanted to do was get an accessible path in. And so yes, we're looking at accessibility with technology, and you're like, this is great, this is creative, but if my friend who's on the project who uses a wheelchair can't get on the site, it feels like the money's going in so I felt quite frustrated sometimes that all this like exciting new stuff, I love, we're working with robotics and soil batteries, and I'm trying to make a snail robot and stuff. It's great fun, but like for me it doesn't seem like it feels like I'm losing the point of what I'm doing if I'm not making this, like not doing the kind of practical accessibility first, especially if I can't access it. Sorry, this is a bit rambly.
No, it's really interesting. Thank you so much. And I think when you're talking, it's really interesting about how access is framed through a kind of digital access. It's something that me and Helen talk about a lot. But I think it's a really interesting thing around it comes back to this idea I think we've touched on around these funding models that kind of predetermine what access means in your context, rather than asking, what does this community need, or what does this space need in order to be accessible? How, you know, digital access is also problematic in many other ways, especially also if we're talking about extraction and those things. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it makes me think a little bit about the idea that Dave had come up with and the A-Space were working with, of like a funding model that comes from the community. And this was the idea, we don't need to get into it because I'd like to move on to our next question, but my thought was around, to go back to this question that has been very rich for us, this idea of alternative models. I was thinking about community commissioning, like why we commission on behalf of a community rather than kind of asking that community what it needs. And I'm sure that does exist, and it would be great if people know models. I'd be really keen to see it. But I think that was a really great example, Ruth, of what those gaps can be, and that it can be more about kind of servicing an idea, that narrative again, than it is actually about what does this need? What do the people using this already need?
I can speak a little to that, Anna. So one of the big pieces of work that my mother did, obviously she's Carib, Indigenous, blah, 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 but also was one of the first women to go to LSE in the 70s and look at, she was a project analyst, so someone really very responsible for putting in these big structures that exist. And one of the things in her later life that she failed at, so when she got into power, one of the things that she did, we need books, and all kids need to have access to libraries. So as a child, we would go and drive around the Caribbean, and there would be these beautiful libraries that were free, properly staffed by librarians, full of books, like making sure education was free. Every single one of them was empty. She spent all that money, and it was totally a failed project. So on her retirement, she worked on a new rethinking the model, and she was hired by the UN. And here's the big thing that was the great thing she learned, was how about we ask the communities what they wanted to have. So she then worked as a facilitator. So she would go into the communities and say, what would you like? And then each community is different. So some would say we want a school hall, some would say we want a music venue, whatever. And then her work was actually getting the community to work together and using her logistical expertise. So she would say, okay, who in the village does bricks, or who would provide the cement, or who would do this? And then in enabling the community to build what it wanted, rather than what she was doing before, which was just landing what she was taught was what was needed. Like someone said, like a spaceship into the community. It ended up never being used, but it also, and this is really important, there's something that really brings pride when you can tell your grandchildren, oh, I helped paint the walls of that, or I helped build the structure, or I did the bake sale that helped, put the fridge or stove into the community center. There's a pride that comes from this sort of agency. So, and I think this is what artists are also really brilliant at, these sorts of projects, because artists, they're really good at being able to communicate with people in a non-hierarchical way as well. And so, just wanted to say they are models out there.
Thank you. I want to, on that note, Helen, and I'm mindful of the time because we're coming up to the last kind of 15 minutes. So I'm I would like us maybe first, if you're okay with it, because I think it really connects with what you're doing there, speaking about there, to jump to your second question and bring that in at this stage. What do you think? And then we can first question.
Yeah.
And do you want to introduce this second question, or would you like I can read it out?
So I think we should use the first question to frame the second question.
Okay, wonderful.
So just read the first question and go straight into the second
I'll ask
question.
it all together. Okay, fantastic. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to read this out. This was from Helen. And this kind of building on what we've talked about here, it sort of expands the scope of this kind of consideration of culture. As Helen's talking about in kind of global and economic terms. So this is the question. Culture is like invisible rivers we swim in. What we consider our rights are not laws of nature, but man-made. This cultural way of being, which focuses on constant economic growth, has led to the current climate change situation and a lived reality that is extractivist to the point where birth rates are plummeting in the global north and China. How do we move to less extractive / extravagant lifestyle without feeling it as a loss? And then the second part of the question, how can artists and culture teach us to value the intangible over the material? So these are two quite expansive questions. And I think we've touched on some of these things before, but I was just thinking about in your introduction, Helen, or you're speaking about this model that your mother had used. I thought that was a really interesting way into this idea of intangible, because I find that word really interesting in how you've used it, this idea of intangibility over the material, especially as I think quite rightly, I feel I'm always very focused on like my material conditions and lack of or precarity of. So I think I think there was something really interesting in this idea of this intangibility. And then obviously we've touched on earlier some of these ideas of this extractivist kind of this idea of growth and degrowth, as you had mentioned. So maybe Rosie, do you want to pick up on this first and then?
Yeah, I love this question. I feel like, I don't know, I have yeah, like maybe two just like tiny points. But I think it's a bit, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, the idea that there needs to be like an exchange or a trade. You know, the woman in the global north not having a child as a choice. And I think as an example, but I think part of me sort of thinks that exchange kind of the dialogue is actually, does that include everyone in the same way? Are we sort of comparing ourselves in this chat to the Elon Musks of the world? I think if you're talking about extraction and extravagant lifestyles, there's a big difference. And especially, I'm thinking as well about the people that I work with and Gemma works with. I think it's a class issue sometimes. I don't expect them to give things up. I don't think they should have to. I don't think it's their fault that we're in this situation, this kind of climate disaster. Yeah, so that's something that I've been sort of thinking about, that kind of exchange or trade-off. I think, it's a difficult one. And then, yeah, I guess also just this idea around just how we might move to a less extractive lifestyle. I mean, I do agree that I and we should do that. But I think maybe as artists, as creative people, thinking about moving towards more experiences and feelings as opposed to stuff. So like the non-monetized experience, and experience and involvement in our communities, which can be really rewarding, could be sort of a way of doing that. That's my thoughts at the moment.
Thank you.
I mean, I think artists naturally live a less extractive lifestyle. That's I've never met an artist. It's very rare to meet an artist who is aspiring to have a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, and a Maserati.
Yeah.
Right? It's just not something that we value in the same way as, oh, I've got an old brush and banger, but I've hand painted it and now I have this really cool thing. It's a different value system. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Elon Musk is the absolute devil. And let's also not forget, he does come from the global south. He is South African, right? So I think artists naturally live. I think there's a beauty in an artistic life and in valuing something that's made rather than something you can just buy easily from a shop.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think Elon Musk, since he's in the conversation, since he has to be here, then just something that I do think is very interesting as the other side of the reproductive refusal is the pronatalist agenda, of which Elon Musk is one of the, kind of most famous proponents in terms of, and I don't really want to give that too much, but there's plenty of conversation out there around that. And I do think that that's very inevitable in a particular kind of worldview from which he emerges, and which is global south, but also colonial global south. And I think for me, and this is a kind of space that I'm in, and I think is I hear the need to be not to flatten the conversation, but I also do think that there is an importance, and I guess I wanted to pick up on this idea of feeling something as a loss. And I do think that there is something about needing to acknowledge our privilege, and privilege does not have to be massive in a global sense to make us absolutely kind of the most sort of, I pride myself on always having a secondhand iPhone, but I still have an iPhone. Do you know what I mean? And I use it as a tool in my life, just as an extension of myself. That's something, these things that are kind of maybe small and also sustain a precarious life in the context in which I'm living, also make me, in a global sense, obviously extraordinarily privileged. And I don't see, aside from if it's going to completely make you unable to act, I really want to promote the idea of facing that, I suppose, and facing it for what it is. And I don't see that as a problem. And just speaking a little bit about the workshops, the first workshop that we did was around climate emotion, and that was one of the things that I was really interested in. Jade M. Sasser has done a lot of work on climate emotion, and more recently about the idea of having children in the current climate. And yeah, so I think that was really important for me, because it's about acknowledging these really difficult feelings, and that it doesn't need to be therefore a place that we stay. Like this idea of feeling guilt, feeling shame, feeling grief, feeling loss. For me, it's important that we allow that, because then that's the way we move into these more active states, right? And are able to engage something that's more felt in a more positive way, like to be inspired, to have empathy, to feel empowered. That's something that's come up a lot today. And I'm certainly not there, but I think for me, the beginning is kind of that was the beginning of this holding space. And for me, that was coming from these kind of negative emotions, and linked to that, this idea of why I use the word childless rather than child-free. And I talked about that a bit in the opening of the exhibition, this idea that actually lessness can be a form of action, and it can hold the space for a future that isn't reproducing what we already have. And to me, I like, this is my feeling, but of course there are other ways, you know, there's many other like ways of being in the world, also of people who are very, you know, like me, on the surface we live very differently, but to me this idea of reproduction is always going to be I can't disentangle that from this kind of extraction, and there are other things too, but for me, that's what this kind of commitment to these other futures is. That's also about, it's not putting that on other people, but it's like, okay, so if I don't do that, maybe I have more capacity, maybe I can hold this space and think about how I am part of a community of care in a different way, for example. So anyway, just wanted to kind of speak to that a little bit. Yeah. So sorry, that was a bit of a rant at the end, my God. Anyway, let us, yeah, so we've got a few more minutes, and I think it would be good, I don't know if we have any more comments in the chat, or if anyone wants to kind of just chip in with any closing questions or comments.
No questions or comments on the chat, but yeah, if anybody would like to unmute and contribute, or has something further they want to say. Otherwise, I guess we could kind of wrap up, and I just wanted to say a huge thank you. That was super interesting. I really enjoyed hearing from all of our panelists, and also all of the questions from the audience. There's some really excellent thoughts and questions. It really does, yeah, these conversations are kind of so much better when we have all of these thoughts and ideas from people who kind of attend. So yeah, thank you for that. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And it would be really nice if we can, I wonder, we can probably export the chat, can we? Because I think that could be quite a nice document if there are links to things. Maybe that's something, if people were happy to do that. Maybe if there's something you don't want, you could say, I want to be out. But I don't know, that could be a really nice thing, just to kind of include those links to things that people are sharing.
I'd like to say, as a very practical note on your excellent report about how much energy was used, is I will be reducing my email use, because that's what I found the most shocking, comparing it to WhatsApp use, how much energy emails use.
Wow.
Right, it was like 3 as compared to 0.00 something.
But Helen, what I know and what other people don't know is the way that you use WhatsApp. I mean, this is, you know,
it's a perfect
degrowth your WhatsApp. No, I'm kidding. Never degrowth your WhatsApp. Helen has WhatsApp on her computer. I'll let everyone into a secret. And, when you engage in conversation with Helen, they're flying at you quicker than you can. It's a pleasure. But you know, carbon costly.
But
so
your document proved my form of communication, because WhatsApp also lets me speak to 4 people simultaneously.
Yep.
Which is, you know, that's just a Trinidadian thing. But yeah, I mean, I really love the conversation. Would love everyone to really think about how we can get people to understand that art is life, because I think that is really what's missing from all of this. That art is life. That's what Sylvia Winter says, language and culture, that is what makes us human. And how we bring the value back to that and away from the current cultural value system, which doesn't tax the rich, which makes no sense to me. Over the years, the gap between the rich and the poor has expanded by 8 times. Why? This is
Look into the Tesla funding model, and then it will become very clear.
it's so crazy. It's so crazy. It's like it literally, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the billionaires have failed policy.
Love that.
Rosie,
No,
do
but
you have any
seriously,
final thoughts?
I think that will be my final comment to all of this. A billionaire is a failed policy. We need to drag them off their thrones. We need to stop worshipping them. We need to stop chasing them for money. We need to stop begging them for money. We need to rip them off their thrones and stomp them into the earth so they can be reborn as people.
Compost the rich.
Really?
Fantastic. We found our title when we put this on YouTube.
Yeah, when we do our artist strike, we can get that on a placard.
I really love that. Compost the rich. Yeah.
Merch coming soon.
Yeah.
I want that on a t-shirt. Rosie, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to add?
I think Helen's kind of just hit the nail on the head, really. Yeah, compost millionaires.
I like the idea of growing my food out of them.
Yeah, exactly. We can still use them. They can be useful.
Yeah. It's a richer and more generative version of
exactly.
Thank you all so much. I'm just looking at my notes, and my final note, which I think maybe is quite nice, is thinking about unionizing and daydreaming. It's like both of these need to happen. So my final thought, and just to say thank you all so much. It's really lovely when people engage and ask questions and are happy to unmute and share, and I look forward to reading back the chat. So thank you very much, and also to people who were listening and participating in that way, and thank you to everyone at GHT and A-Space for making this possible, and it's a real privilege to be able to have this conversation. So thank you for hosting us and inviting us to be here. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you.
It's been fascinating. Really brilliant. Thank you.
Really enjoyed. That was really interesting. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Lovely evening. Bye-bye.